Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for spending some time with us today. With me today to talk about tackling contemporary anti-Semitism and the keys to protecting Jewish communities around the world is David Peyman, Deputy Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism at the United States Department of State. In his role, Mr. Peyman focuses on anti-Semitism occurring in Europe and much of Asia, and serves as the lead on certain strategic projects, including the global Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, BDS movement against Israel. Mr. Peyman previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Counter-Threat Finance and Sanctions, having led the Office of Economic Sanctions Policy and Implementation and the Office of Threat Finance Countermeasures. And there, Mr. Peyman managed 25 sanctions programs for the Secretary of State, including those on Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. He joined the State Department from BlackRock, Inc., having previously served as a Special Assistant United States Attorney and Deputy Attorney General of California. Today, Mr. Peyman and I will speak about the State Department's efforts to monitor and condemn acts of hate and violence against Jews globally, and discuss his efforts in the Special Envoy's office to proactively counter the BDS movement and all forms of anti-Semitism, his views on countries choosing not to ban Hezbollah, and the security of Jewish communities around the world. David, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Dan, thank you so much for having me. Let me just say it's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. B'nai B'rith was founded, I know, before the Civil War. And your organization has done a tremendous amount for the United States, for the American people, Jews and non-Jews alike, everything from housing to healthcare, and of course for the state of Israel and Jews all around the world. So it's really my honor to be joining you this morning.
Well, thank you. It's very nice of you to say that. And actually, today is the actual date, October 13th, 1843, when the organization was founded. It's our 177th birthday today. So thank you for saying that.
Then it's a double honor to be with you.
It is indeed. Thank you. Thank you. I want to talk about how you took your career from being a prosecutor, you were Deputy Attorney General, in the law, you taught law. How did you get to the area of pursuing a career in holding malign actors accountable?
Dan, thank you for that question. You know, the United States has given me and my family a tremendous amount. Every opportunity that I've received, it's because I've been privileged to grow up in such a great country. So I decided at a very early time in my career to devote my career, or much of it, to giving back to this wonderful country, starting with becoming a prosecutor, both for the California Attorney General's office and the United States Attorney's office, prosecuting international money laundering, narcotics crimes, mortgage fraud crimes for the California DOJ. And then I was privileged enough to have a role at BlackRock, where I was leading BlackRock's global sanctions efforts across the world, sanctions compliance efforts around the world, creating their sanctions infrastructure. BlackRock is an asset manager that has now, I think, over $7 trillion in assets under management. When I was there, it was about $6.5 trillion. And so doing sanctions compliance for an entity that is able to invest in so many parts of the world and can really impact US policy based on where their investment decisions lay was important for me. And then finally, having the privilege and opportunity to work for the Trump administration in my previous role as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Sanctions, and now Deputy Special Envoy for BDS. So we did a tremendous amount, I think, in creating the strongest infrastructure the United States have ever had against Iran with respect to Iran sanctions, similarly with respect to Venezuela sanctions, North Korea sanctions. And now we're hoping to tackle the problem of the global BDS movement. President Trump has called, the very first president of the United States has clearly called an anti-Semitic movement.
Well, we want to talk about sanctions in a moment, but let's talk about the mission of your office, which is led by our good friend, Special Envoy Ilan Carr. It's to monitor and combat anti-Semitism around the world. And we hear about efforts to monitor, track, and condemn acts of hate and violence against Jews globally. But what efforts can be made to proactively counter and combat anti-Semitism before it occurs?
Great question. Under Ilan's leadership, we determined that we need to start going on offense when it comes to combating anti-Semitism. Historically, much of what our office has done was play defense. For example, ensuring security of Jews in Europe and around the world, ensuring hate crimes against Jews are appropriately charged and prosecuted, ensuring countries adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and appointing special envoys to tackle the problem of anti-Semitism. That is all playing defense in a sense. So under Ilan's leadership, we decided as a strategic initiative, as a special project, to start playing offense. What does that mean? First and foremost, it means understanding what lies at the core of anti-Semitism, and in effect, creating a vaccine against this awful cancer, this virus, recognizing you may not be able to destroy it completely from the world, but at least to create a vaccine where you're able to protect the Jewish communities across the world from it as much as possible. And so at the core of anti-Semitism is really a spiritual sickness. It's a sickness that is opposed to the spiritual revolution that Jews brought to the world, to humanity. The Jewish values, such as B'Tselem Elokim, being created in God's image. Jewish values, such as ethical monotheism and the rejection of moral relativism, the same moral relativism that allowed Nazi Germany and its collaborators across Europe to justify murdering innocent men, women, and children, while ironically having one of the strongest animal rights laws in history. And so that kind of moral relativism is exactly what the Jews rejected. And you can't tell the history of Germany, 1700 years of Jewish presence, without telling the history of the Jewish people. You can't tell the history of the United States without telling the history of the Jewish people. Our official motto in the United States, passed by Congress, signed into law by President Eisenhower, is God we trust, hitting home the point of ethical monotheism that the Jews brought to the world. So in order to be proactive on this issue, we think it's important to educate the masses, educate the world, and ensure that we embrace and celebrate Jewish history, heritage, and Jewish values. Because Jewish history is much greater than the Holocaust. Jewish history is much greater than being victims of Nazi Germany. It's a proud history that has really contributed to societies all over the world, and whose values are now so ingrained, part and parcel of almost every society in the world, that we tend to take it for granted. But these are values and ideas introduced by the Jewish people. And to the extent you want to call it Jewish heritage or Jewish values education or philosemitic education, this campaign to ensure that the global communities know who the Jewish people are, where they come from, where they were born, and the core values that they introduced to the world is an important part, I think, of being proactive on this issue. Interestingly, Jewish texts also talk about the importance of embracing Jewish core values as a protection to and a response to the enemy of the Jewish people, or the enemies of the Jewish people that may present themselves throughout history. And indeed, the idea of tikkun olam, repair of the world, in Jewish texts discusses really repair of our world, repair of our personal worlds, and adopting and embracing and understanding Jewish values, we think is an important part of that. To the extent people understand that the Jews have really contributed immense amount to their respective societies, that will put the evil of the Holocaust in better context, and hopefully will allow countries to really organically and genuinely not only protect Jews, but adopt, embrace, and celebrate their Jewish citizens.
When you meet with diplomats in Europe, for example, and you raise this issue of this positive education about Jewish history, many of these countries have very small Jewish populations. I'm wondering just aloud, exactly how much the history of the Jews in country X or country Y makes it into the curricula in these countries. What do they say when you raise this idea?
By and large, countries are receptive to this idea, because when you're talking about Jewish contributions, you also have to recognize that governments throughout history have created the space and the opportunities for Jews to contribute to their respective countries. And so we need to recognize that as well. But I think governments are largely receptive to this idea. This is an initiative that has to be undertaken not simply by governments, certainly with their support and encouragement, but by local Jewish communities in respective countries. Jews have contributed in different ways in Germany than they may have in France or in Hungary or Romania or Poland. And highlighting those times of Jewish history in their respective countries, I think, is important. But there's also the idea of universal Jewish values that Jews across the world recognize and have largely adopted, and countries around the world have largely adopted.
As Deputy Special Envoy, your area of focus includes Eurasia, BDS, and special projects. I'd like you to go into detail, if you can, on how your office views BDS and what you're doing to counter the BDS movement. Because we know, in the beginning, those who would apologize for BDS or explain BDS, they would say, well, this is just criticism. It's not really anti-Semitism. We know now that this perhaps is the ultimate anti-Semitism in terms of denying the Jewish people the right to their own sovereign existence. So how does your office view the BDS issue?
So let me just say, President Trump is the very first president that has publicly and clearly articulated that BDS is anti-Semitic. It's an anti-Semitic movement. Secretary Pompeo is the very first Secretary of State that has done so. And Special Envoy Carr is the first Special Envoy that has recognized BDS as being anti-Semitic. So it's very, very important to first clearly define the problem. President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, and Special Envoy Carr have also said anti-Zionism, which is a large part of the BDS movement, is also anti-Semitic. The idea of denying or rejecting the rightful role of the Jewish people in the world, the right to have their own homeland, to reestablish Jewish sovereignty after 3,000 years of exile from their whole homeland. The rejection of that idea is anti-Semitic. And President Trump, to his credit, has taken the leadership role in recognizing that. Second, the president, Secretary Pompeo, and the Special Envoy have invested a tremendous amount in office in terms of resources. And in my role now, I'm the first point person to specifically focus on the BDS problem, to ensure that there's a whole of government approach in tackling the BDS problem. So BDS fits also squarely within the IRA definition of anti-Semitism by using a double standard, to judge Israel, and by recognizing or proclaiming that Israel is a racist state or engages in racist endeavors. And the UNHRC, the Human Rights Council, exemplifies these kinds of anti-Semitic attitudes. The UNHRC has one standing item against one country in the world, and they've decided to focus exclusively and to malign and to demonize exclusively the one nation of the Jewish people, the only nation of the Jewish people. And the recent list of entities or companies doing business in Israel, interestingly, 85% of the entities on that list are Jewish. 85% are Jewish or Jewish owned and operated. 5% are American owned and operated. That's 90% of the entities on that list. There's over 25,000 Arab companies operating in Judea and Samaria. Not one of them is on that list. So you can draw your own conclusion as to the motivation and intention behind this list if the vast majority are focused on Jewish businesses. And so what we want to do is ensure that we're bringing all legal and policy tools to the table in addressing the BDS movement, hard tools that is going to present consequences for those that engage in BDS, non-governmental organizations and others, ensuring those that are targeted by the BDS campaign are adequately and appropriately protected, and also soft tools, such as ensuring that there's greater commercial, scientific, educational, cultural engagement globally with the state of Israel. And now with the Abrahamic Accords, it presents a new opportunity to ensure that is extended to the Gulf states as well. And so we also want to ensure other countries are recognizing the BDS campaign as anti-Semitic. A lot of credit goes to Germany and most recently the Czech Republic for condemning the BDS movement as an anti-Semitic movement. So the president, the secretary have really poured a lot of resources into this issue to ensure we tackle it appropriately with all the tools, policy and legal tools possible to finally try to kill this anti-Semitic cancer, this virus that's known as the BDS movement.
Let me go back just to follow up, as I did on the previous question. You mentioned Germany and the Czech Republic. Long way to go in Europe because a lot of countries, European Union, you have the individual countries and their positions, you have the EU position. What are the diplomats telling you when you raise the BDS issue? When you meet with the Europeans, for example?
Sure. I was appointed to this role only a few months ago during the height of COVID. So I haven't had a chance to travel to Europe yet to meet my European counterparts. I have spoken to many of them. And I could tell you, many recognize in private conversations the problems with BDS, the fact that BDS employs anti-Semitic tropes, the fact that BDS is inherently a racist anti-Jewish movement that seeks the destruction of the Jewish state and the destruction of the Jewish people by default. And so they recognize it. I think it's a matter of making sure the data speaks for itself, identifying the organizations that engage in BDS, identifying the data that shows that these organizations are inherently anti-Semitic or act in ways that are consistent with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, presenting that data, compiling it, presenting it, and ensuring that the governments across Europe who have not yet condemned BDS are actually going to take this back and have a real, honest look at these organizations that can engage in BDS and identify them as such. And I think that would be a tremendous first step. There has to be more. There has to be more. One of the things we're trying to do is encourage countries to appoint an anti-Semitism czar, whether you want to call it a special envoy or an officer or a coordinator, but someone who takes a whole of government approach, who can ensure that there's consistency when you're talking about protecting and embracing your Jewish populations. Because you can't profess to love the Jewish people while at the same time sponsoring, funding, facilitating, recognizing those that are committed to this destruction of the Jewish people, whether those are BDS organizations or Hezbollah or Iran. There has to be a consistent approach. And people understand these messages. People understand that when a country professes to protect its Jews, but yet facilitates funding to, directly or indirectly, the likes of an Islamic regime in Iran or Hezbollah, or allows them to operate in their countries, Hezbollah to operate in their countries, or otherwise facilitates funding to BDS organizations, there's a sense of hypocrisy in that kind of position. Because if you're protecting the Jewish people, how can you then fund those that have sworn publicly to want to murder and in fact have murdered Jews and to want to destroy only Jewish state? So it's important to have a consistent approach when you're talking about combating anti-Semitism.
Well, I'm pleased that you raised the issue of the blacklist at the UN Human Rights Council, because this underscores in a very stark way how the UN system, particularly Human Rights Council, sometimes UNESCO, and other agencies as well, how the system is used, particularly by the Palestinians and their allies, to delegitimize Israel within the framework of an organization, the UN, which is a member of the quartet, and which is supposed to be promoting negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians and not taking one side against the other. But UN bias, that's a topic perhaps for another discussion. But you did mention Hezbollah, and we're talking about Europe. And I want to ask you about the Hezbollah question in Europe. Not every country there has outlawed the entire Hezbollah terrorist organization. Of course, Hezbollah, backed by Iran, which, if we're speaking about anti-Semitism, let alone the nuclear program, let alone all of the other activity that they're engaged in. Iran, which has led Holocaust denial conferences, cartoon competitions, and declared its desire to eradicate the world's only Jewish state, and it does that on a daily basis. How do you approach work regarding bad actors like Hezbollah in Iran that continue, as I say, on a daily basis to spew anti-Israel and anti-Semitic hatred?
Sure. Let me just make a quick point on the UN Human Rights Commission. The points you made are reasons why President Trump courageously withdrew U.S. membership and participation from the UNHRC. So President Trump was able to recognize that they're acting in anti-Semitic ways, targeting unfairly, demonizing unfairly the state of Israel, and made the courageous decision to withdraw. And we hope others around the world will follow his lead. So when we're talking about Iran, let's first recognize that Iran's former president, Rafsanjani, has been indicted by Argentina for mass murder, for the bombing of a Jewish community center in Argentina that killed 85 individuals and wounded hundreds and hundreds of others. And other senior members of the Iranian regime have also been indicted by Argentina for attacking a Jewish center. Hezbollah obviously has a notorious history as well. With respect to Hezbollah, any distinction between their political and military arm is, we know, a false distinction. You'd have to imagine there's some kind of corporate veil separating Hezbollah's political arm from its terror. But even if you buy into that fallacy, it is the political social arm of Hezbollah that creates anti-Semitic content and distributes it throughout their educational system. And the ADL has done tremendous work in this area to reveal that anti-Semitic content as well. So this is the evidence, this is the data that you can't walk away from. And it begs the question why anybody should be supporting or facilitating, directly or indirectly financing to the likes of a terror organization like Hezbollah, or an Islamic regime that has engaged in acts of murder, has been indicted for acts of murder against Jews, against Jewish institutions, that has put on Holocaust denial conferences with the likes of white supremacists such as David Duke, and that engages in anti-Semitic behavior almost daily, including by encouraging this anti-Semitic Holocaust cartoon competition that they hold in Iran. So these are facts you can't walk away from. And it begs the question how you can profess to protect Jewish communities. Going back to my initial point, how can you profess to protect, love, and embrace Jewish communities when you are at the same time facilitating, funding, supporting, recognizing those that sworn to destroy the Jewish state, the only Jewish state in the world, and also attack the Jewish people. And by the way, the Islamic regime also engages in acts of terrorism against Europeans on European soil. There was an attempted bombing plot in Paris in 2018, and assassination attempts in other countries in Europe by Iranian diplomats. So it really begs the question of the logic of that approach. And these are information that we're presenting. Obviously, the Europeans, our European counterparts and partners, know about much of this information, but engaging in honest dialogue, hard and honest dialogue, to see if there's an opportunity to perhaps take a different approach, and to recognize what Iran actually is, which is the number one state sponsor of terrorism and the number one purveyor of anti-Semitic hate throughout the world.
If I can just ask you, David, just to put on your previous hat for a moment, talking about sanctions and about Iran. This month, the sanctions, the UN approved sanctions on the transfer of conventional weapons to the embargo to Iran will expire. And we've seen nothing but, except for the administration's position, we've seen nothing in Europe that says this is a dangerous thing. If we allow this to lapse, the opening of the spigot for conventional weapons to Iran and the ultimate transshipment of these weapons to other malign actors in the region could only further exacerbate the malign behavior that they're engaged in right now. Why do you think it is that, particularly in Europe, there is a reluctance to support an extension of this embargo?
Dan, thanks for the question. I don't want to guess and hypothesize as to why Europe takes the actions they do. I do know that under Special Representative Hook and his leadership, who I worked very closely with, and now Special Representative Abrams and his leadership, these are issues that are being discussed with our European counterparts, and they've done a tremendous amount, both Brian Hook and Elliot Abrams, to ensure that countries around the world are complying with, even if they may not agree with U.S. sanctions against Iran, but will comply with U.S. sanctions against Iran. And I think that's the important point. At the end of the day, are people willing to sacrifice doing business with the greatest economy in the world in exchange for getting into bed with terrorist sponsoring modes in Iran? And that's the choice many countries have made, and I think many countries have made it correctly. But I'll defer to Special Representative Elliot Abrams to go into the details with respect to his approach on Iran sanctions.
So I want to talk now about something that's on everybody's mind. That's the coronavirus. From your perspective in the Special Envoy's office, how has the coronavirus pandemic affected your role? Has the COVID-19 virus caused anti-Semitism, another type of virus, to spread even more? I mean, we've seen so many examples, particularly in the early weeks of the pandemic, and particularly on the internet, all kinds of accusations, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and not only, by the way, here in this country, but around the world as well. So how has this new, if you will, this new mutant of the coronavirus anti-Semitism affected your work?
Yeah, well, Dan, look, anti-Semitism, as I indicated earlier, is a spiritual sickness. So these anti-Semites latch onto the news cycle, the events, and the issues of our day and of our time. And anti-Semitism manifests itself through these different events throughout history. And coronavirus is just one example. Special Envoy Carr has also appointed a point person, Ephraim Cohen, to ensure that we're monitoring and combating online anti-Semitism. And so you see a lot of hate directed against Jews with respect to coronavirus, blood libels against Jews in the context of coronavirus online. And Ephraim, I think, has done a tremendous job in monitoring that, ensuring or helping to ensure social media platforms recognize anti-Semitic content, obviously while protecting free speech. But that's not to say that they can't provide links and information and flag anti-Semitic content and recognize it and recognize it for what it is, while at the same time perhaps providing links to those that sites that spread anti-Semitic content, to Jewish education, Philo-Semitic education, Jewish values education, to reveal the true history and the contributions of the Jewish people. It's created a lot more work for the office. But to their credit, President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, and Special Envoy Carr have invested also tremendously in the office. So now we have the largest office to combat and monitor anti-Semitism ever. And that office is now growing. It's continuing to grow, and hopefully will continue to grow into 2021 as well. And so it's created more work, created more opportunities as well to have good, positive conversations with social media platforms to ensure we're taking a responsible approach to monitoring and combating anti-Semitism online, including recognizing it. And in context of violence or incitement to violence, perhaps those are opportunities where the message should be taken down, not only flagged as anti-Semitic, but removed. But when it's not an incitement to violence, perhaps that's also an opportunity to educate the global community on Jewish heritage and Jewish values.
So finally, one more question. How do you feel about the outlook on the security of Jewish communities around the globe as we enter a new Jewish year, looking ahead, anti-Semitism spiking everywhere? What's your prognosis, just looking down the road, let's say over the short term?
I'm hopeful, and here's why I'm hopeful. I think we're having very, very positive conversations with our European counterparts. Our efforts to ensure countries are adopting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, because you can't kill and attack the problem unless you define it, have borne fruit, and we're going to continue in that engagement. Our efforts now, starting on the BDS campaign, to bring legal and policy tools to the fight against BDS, I think are going to bear fruit, hopefully in the near future. Our efforts on Philo-Semitic education, which is so important, hopefully in the next year will start to bear fruit. You know, in the United States, we have Jewish Heritage Month, and that is a month that has been recognized by every president, I believe, since Ronald Reagan, but not many people know about it because the Jewish communities in the United States don't do much about it. African American Heritage Month, you know a lot about it because the African American community organizes and presents content to schools and media and other platforms. And to take that opportunity to ensure we're disseminating Philo-Semitic education, Jewish values education, I think will do a tremendous amount in the fight against anti-Semitism in the long term. And we may see the results of those efforts, not immediately, but over the next couple of years. But I think the important point is that we're now laying the seeds in terms of the Philo-Semitic initiatives, the BDS campaign, ensuring countries adopt or appoint special envoys to take a whole of government approach to ensure that there's no inconsistency in protecting Jews and supporting or funding or facilitating funding toward groups like Hezbollah or Iran. So I'm hopeful, in short, for the future.
Well, Deputy Special Envoy Peyman, thank you for speaking with us about your office's efforts to combat anti-Semitism across the globe and sharing your insights on Jewish security around the globe. We really appreciate your being here today.
Dan, it's my pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much.
Well, special thanks to Deputy Special Envoy David Peyman for joining me today. And thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you like what you hear, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon. Take care, everyone.